Welcome to Dr. SteamDeck, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Linux. It's a history panel. We're going to be going through kind of the weird series of coincidences that ended up today with now a much beloved system and the many things that have come from that. So we'll break right into it. Let's go. So just a quick introduction. Longtime Linux tinker. I was big into trying to run games on my Linux systems at home back before that was good. So I was running through probably every search possible just to get one game to kind of work. And that's how it was for a lot of years. But my tinkering with this ended up with my entire career, so I'll take it. I've been following this along just because I've been trying to, more or less, as they say in League of Legends, force it down mid by trying to make Linux works every time. So install, try everything. No, we'll try it again. So loop back. So I've basically been through this in real time, all the news articles. It's been pretty fun. And so I'll be citing some articles about some of the history about it, but also some of my personal stories, just kind of explanation on that. So let's get started. The year is 2012. Windows 8 is here. Unfortunate. We really, it's, at least there's one person out there. This was a controversial decision by Microsoft, to put it lightly. But you can see kind of what they're trying to go for with the interface here. Everything's tiles, down to the point of every Windows program you have has to be run from within one of those tiles for the desktop, and that's basically where everybody was. But it has a bit of a controversial addition here, and that is the presence of the Windows App Store. Windows 8 has introduced a new system of full-screen unified applications, and now Microsoft is in the business of distributing this to you directly, and they're not going to rely on you getting this from the CD at your local Staples or going online to download it. They're just going to run the App Store themselves, trying to get on a little bit of that iPhone piece of the pie. But this is, a bit concerning. Gabe's not happy about this. At this point, this is Valve's predominant moneymaker. At this time, they were still making a lot of games on top of each other, but it's obviously important to him as somebody who was also ex-Microsoft that it's like, hey, we're going to make sure that this market can still exist. But Microsoft seems to be pushing along a vision that's going to be unified. You can build this game or application once. It'll run on your Xbox. It'll run on your PC, etc. And they're going to get their cut, and that's going to kind of cut Valve out of the equation. So what in the world are you to do if you're in a situation where you are at the behest of Microsoft, right? Your entire business runs here, and now they're saying that they kind of want to push you aside. Why not Linux? It's kind of a strange idea, and I'll illustrate that with another slide. But basically, this is Valve's power play to say, hey, we're not entirely bound to Microsoft. Can you guys maybe chill a little bit, or we're going to push pretty hard on this? It's also a hedge. You put in the work now, and then in the event that Microsoft really does say, oops, you can't install your own applications, a la an iOS, they already have the infrastructure built out. They can move on from it. And they kind of already did a little bit of this. Mac OS X at the time was supported as of 2 years prior. Remember when that was exciting? It's not in a great state these days, but at the time, that was serious business. So now they're going to bring this on. And in Valve HQ, they're like, Ubuntu's the most popular. Let's just use that one. That has some consequences. We'll come back to that too. But kind of the state of Linux at the time was you were the type of person to install this because you really wanted to use the desktop cube, or you were, which was this effect, or just any number of just kind of tinkering with your system. But it's not phenomenal at running games. There's not a big library of them. Obviously, you have your kind of indie games like your Super Tux Kart, etc., which are built with it in mind. It's a classic for sure. But there's not a lot of extended support here. It's all volunteer made, right? At the end of the day, Linux is a whole ecosystem made by people who are doing it to contribute it back, mostly just completely for free, and just kind of giving away their labor to everybody else, and everybody builds on it. So it's not exactly profitable, unless you're in kind of like a consulting business or something like this. So this is the current state of what we're walking into. And Gabe, in a kind of interesting situation, he was on stage in Seattle at a game developers conference, on stage with a VP from Microsoft, And he said, we want to make it as easy as possible for the 2,500 games on Steam to run on Linux as well. It's a hedging strategy. I think Windows 8 is a catastrophe for everyone in the PC space. Saying that directly on stage next to the Microsoft guy must have been kind of an awkward moment, but he's kind of right. He needs to push it on. Okay, Valve HQ. They're like, okay, we're going to work on this client, but we kind of need a game first. Their first decision, they're going to port over Left 4 Dead 2. At the time, relatively recent. They had done this 2 years prior for macOS. And so Macs had a version of this, and they use what's called OpenGL, we'll get to that next slide, to run the graphics on it, which is quite different from how you would run this on your regular gaming PC at home with Windows. So they decide, okay, we're simultaneously releasing, we have to have Left 4 Dead 2, and we have to have the Steam client. OpenGL, again, just kind of, we're going to kind of go over some descriptions of technologies here. It'll add up as we go, so trust me on it. It's the graphics API. Think of it the way your game asks your computer, hey, can you please show this square? You have kind of a language for that. And so OpenGL works everywhere. That's on your Macs, that's on your Windows, that's on your Linux systems, it's on Android, everything. And for a time, that's pretty cool. It's not as full-featured, though. In Windows, you have what's called DirectX, which is quite a large library that does a whole lot of things. But it's targeting, like, basically every game engine uses it because it's the most performant, it's the most advanced at the time. And there's a whole lot of standards for it. They're all pretty interesting how layered they get on top of each other. We're now at 12, which is incredibly different from 7, for example. But you just have that number to target. So that's kind of what we'll loop back to. And it can only run on Windows unless we're going to enter Wine. Wine stands for, Wine is not an emulator because we love recursive backronyms in the Linux community for some reason. We'll go with it. Basically, this is kind of a layer you can run that just lets your Windows applications work elsewhere. So you can pick up these games, run them, or regular software, and just pick it up and run it, and maybe it works. At the time, there is a company that's actively paying to work on this, but it's mostly, it's like office software and things like that. It's not really what you would say is like very gaming focused at the time. And otherwise, part of how this works, because of legal, you're not allowed to actually know how Windows works and then work on Wine, because that would be a legal no-no. Instead, everybody who's working on it has to tear it apart and reverse engineer every piece of it to make it work. This has some interesting consequences, but a notable thing is that if you're running a video game at the time, like DirectX 9, backwards, etc., you can just make that OpenGL. Pretty cool. And I just wanted to include this video. It's kind of a demonstration of this in action, of even before we had a Linux port or Left 4 Dead 2, you could run these games. This video is incredibly dated, and I was really considering muting the video, but I think in its full glory, you have to consume 2010 for what it's worth. Of course it's Let the Bodies Hit the Floor. The internet's an incredible place, huh? Remember when this was every video for years? Also, remember when Steam looked like that? This is crazy. I was pulling up this footage again. I was like, I barely remember this. Anyway, you see, it renders the game. So you can boot up Left 4 Dead. It's not perfect, right? It's a bit slower, but it'll get you going. Especially if you're just like, darn it, I don't want to reboot. This is a matter of principle, which was me. So at the time. But, you know, as part of the support, so you could run games. But at the time, mostly it's DirectX 9 and backwards are the ones that work the best. So if you're running something like World of Warcraft or something, it works pretty well. A lot of older games at the time had both a DirectX 9 and a DirectX 11, because a lot of graphics cards didn't support the new stuff. So that kind of worked. But, you know, the march of time keeps going, and DirectX 11 happens. and it's not super well supported. There's some real hiccups. There's some graphical glitches. It's not perfect. But, you know, in comparison to not having it at all, if you didn't have a Windows computer, we'll take it. And kind of at around the same time, Valve is trying to get into the running your games from your couch business, and determines that they are going to make big picture mode. Now, this kind of leads into people wondering about, okay, is there a Valve console? What are we doing? They're just like, for now, it's just you can run games from your couch, and that looks pretty nice. But, you know, it's a console-like interface. They're kind of getting into that UI. It's very different from that old Steam UI. And at the same time, now Valve's in this business. They're like, okay, now we have to make sure pretty much every controller kind of works with this, because otherwise the product's kind of DOA, especially in the PC space. Everybody has like a million different kinds of controllers that are unique for various circumstances. If you're like a flight sim player, or if you like a Sony, if you're a Nintendo, Xbox, etc. And you kind of want the buttons to show up on the screen to make sense. So Valve gets into the business of making an API, it's Steam input, and they really put a pressure on, hey, game developers, can you please let us kind of show whatever the actual button is? It would really help. So they're kind of now in the console software interface business, but they're not really there. It is now 2013. After the announcement that had occurred about 4 months prior, they released the Linux Steam client. Lots of native built games. Most of it's indie games, but you have some big ones. Valve brings their entire major game portfolio quite quickly. A lot of it all at the same time. So you have your Team Fortress 2s, your Counter-Strikes, etc., all come around, and that's kind of the bulk of your big player base. But also you have your Left 4 Dead 2. And there's a lot of indie studios, and such as the team of Super Meat Boy, VVVVV, Braid, etc., all drop games at the same time for this launch. So they're wanting to make a splash with it. They don't want you to install an entirely different OS just because they told you to, and then there's no games. And then you have the chicken egg problem. That's a bit unavoidable. So Valve needs to make a splash. We've got the games in place. We've got the new store. We got the client. We think it runs great. How are we going to reach the consumer? Team Fortress 2 items. The most kind of substantial way that this was really pushed, especially with the TF2 community, and this is during peak hat mania, more or less, right? It's such a unique idea, but they're not like that common, so when you do have it, it's kind of a flex. And then Valve kind of unfortunately created the microtransactions model that some people really don't like these days. But at the time, if you started up your system on Linux and you ran TF2, you got the Penguin. You couldn't see it, it was behind you, but you could have it, and that's big, because somebody else doesn't have it. Okay, so now you've kind of got this in place, I've got a big launch, and now you have to have kind of a reason to want to invest in this infrastructure, right? Otherwise, everyone's just going to kind of, they're going to coast on it a little bit. They're going to be like, yeah, it's a cool idea, but I don't really want to touch it. So how do you get people excited? First of all, what if you drop a PC that's kind of like a console? This is the Piston, as it was called, by XI3, and they unveiled it at CES. And the way XI3 talked about it was that they were in direct talks with Valve, and that this was like a big thing. Really, Valve just kind of paid them to do it, and Valve later on, after the coverage of this was so big, was more or less saying, hey, yeah, like we're working with other vendors too, don't worry about it. I mean, it's kind of a strange design for a computer, especially with gaming in mind. The thermals on that must have been incredible to experience, for sure. But this is kind of your first big splash. This makes a lot of news, especially at the time. And they say, okay, now the news is talking about it. Gamers are kind of aware, hey, there's this thing going on. What if you throw a controller in with it too? It's the Steam controller. This picture is, it's the Steam controller and the Steam machine idea are kind of announced around the same time. This is a picture of the old one. I think it's notable for kind of the future design idea. They really thought it would be good to just not have regular face buttons. I don't know what they were thinking in that meeting. Their design here was you had buttons in each corner of a little screen, and then everything else was the tactile movement. Tactile movement on the real controller worked out great, but you can see this is kind of like an inkling of like okay, we can do a screen-in device. We can manufacture that ourselves. And then, what if you throw on top of it, what if we just make an entire operating system? So Valve kind of gets in the business where they say, okay, we're going to release this called SteamOS. So we're going to base it on Debian. It's Ubuntu's relative, its father, really. So you kind of, in that same, everything more or less works the same. But now Valve is in control, and they say, hey, we can do updates on our own time. You're not beholden to Canonical, the people who run Ubuntu, to then break your stuff. They'll do that anyway, as we'll kind of talk about. But at the time, this was, great to experience. They're like, oh, Valve's going to maintain this, and it's going to be gaming-centric. Let's go. So this all combined has created a lot of media buzz. You now have a lot of people who are all talking about, ooh, these fancy new Steam machines. What are we going to do with these? And so a lot of companies, now publishers, start paying to get their games ported. And they're basing these ports on that kind of Ubuntu SteamOS base. Mind you, there's some caveats to this that will cause problems. That Ubuntu base was 32-bit, and it was hard tied in to use a bunch of dependencies that are liable to break at any time. But at the time, this was great, because you could just boot up and just play Civ 5 on day one, and they have a team who are maintaining that port. But it's not the main developers. So that will cause run-ons. But pretty substantial amount of games are ported over with the expectation that, hey, we're about to introduce this whole console ecosystem thing from Valve. And at the same time, Valve's not even stopping swinging. They're going to announce something. It's called Vulkan, as part of a whole consortium. It's a new graphics API. So like DirectX, like OpenGL we talked about earlier, it's going to be kind of the language that your graphics card's going to be speaking with your games and software. In part of this, unlike OpenGL, Vulkan lets you get really into the nitty-gritty details. So it's a bit harder to get started, but you have a little more flexibility with what you have. You can do a little compute with it. It's pretty cool. And the original version of this was put together by AMD and DICE, the game studio that makes Battlefield. They decided that, I guess at some point, they really didn't like Microsoft's shtick with graphics with how Battlefield games are releasing. And so they team up and they say, okay, we're going to put together this new thing called Mantle. Nobody really uses it, but there's a couple games that do, obviously the Battlefield series, some kind of one-offs, and AMD doesn't really port it. They say, hey, we're going to make this run everywhere, but by the time they just decide, the heck with it, they hand it over, and it only runs in Windows. And the driver support's really only from the AMD drivers. NVIDIA really didn't try very hard to make it work. Wouldn't you believe it? A competitor would do that. That's a bit strange. And this has an interesting setup. Like OpenGL now, Vulkan will run everywhere, except Apple, because Apple said so. And they insist, can you please not use this Vulkan thing? Apple at the same time says, hey, we've got Metal. Isn't it cool? This has fragmented the gaming ecosystem for Mac quite substantially, because now there's all these knock-on effects, until very recently, we'll come back to that, where at the time, games are all being published, and you can say, yeah, we can go multi-platform, we can use Vulkan, and then we'll have to translate something else. A little tangent here on the side. A little bit later, Valve themselves get tired of this with Dota 2, and they say, okay, Apple, you're not upgrading OpenGL, so it's using a really old one, and you're not supporting Vulkan. So they make an entire system just to convert these calls over, just because they don't want to stop writing in Vulkan. It's pretty cool. Back on. A loop back on this is that as part of the development of the standard, they said, okay, all the graphics card companies, you're in. You're going to have opinions on this, and we're going to create one standard so that we don't have what happened to AMD last time, where they create something and everyone says, no thanks. So this is pretty nice. At the time, though, when this is announced, again, it's more complicated than OpenGL. And so a lot of people just don't work with it because they're like, it's a bit more difficult. Some emulators will, but there we go. 2015, we have hardware release. Exciting. We have now the release of the very new Steam machines. So this is an example of one from Zotac, but there's an entire series from a bunch of different manufacturers, all at the same time, tiny little box, and they say, you can hook this up, it runs SteamOS, and you can play games on it. Cool. It's the perfect thing for your multimedia setup. But at the same time, they released a controller, which, doesn't look insane. There's buttons on it now, so that's an improvement. And at the same time, they released something called the Steam Link, which you plug into your TV and it streams from your PC. And it's really cheap. It's like $30 or something. It's not bad. There's a problem here they kind of cannibalized their own system. When they said, hey, we're going to make the system that lets you stream your games to your TV, that meant you really didn't have a reason to buy a whole PC anymore because it's more or less the same, and now you can run all of your Windows games. So there's not a big reason to buy in here. 7 months after release, 500,000 units are sold. That sounds pretty good. On day one of the PS4 and Xbox One, 1 million were sold each. So the market penetration's really not there. And at the time, it feels like it's kind of, what were you thinking there? There's not really a great support pipeline here. And at the same time, part of how Valve was planning to advance this was we're going to say, okay, but you're going to want to use Linux if you're going to have to start paying $100+ for a new Windows version. And then Microsoft says, hey, we'll just give it away for free. And it's like, what's our motivation now to work with this? Because now we're getting a free upgrade to a new system, so we're going to keep running all new games, and the new system's kind of good. So do you have a reason to really try a whole Linux install? For a lot of consumers, the answer is no. And so this does not go spectacularly. This is discontinued in about a year for most vendors. They just kind of give up, which, I can't blame them with kind of how the market penetration was. And this was pretty seen as a kind of a dead-on-arrival situation, right? You have all this momentum leading up. Check out these cool new devices. It's all coming together. We've got a new operating system. You're going to want to use it. And then the reason that you would really want to develop for it kind of fizzles out and dies, and everyone's not really taking it very well. So we've kind of now entered a bit of a lull period. Now the enthusiasm's a bit down. This was not a very fun time to be gaming on Linux because you have all of these games that are ported, ready to go, and now they're breaking because your systems are upgrading. This kind of comes back to when those companies were doing the port jobs, and when they were writing these games to begin with, they specifically were writing it for that 32-bit 2012 version of Ubuntu. And now, 3-4 years on, now you have the problem where it's changed a lot under the covers. Microsoft, in contrast, has a kind of a policy of please never break anything, to the point where there's some kind of absurd things that still work in Windows today. But in Linux, that's every part of the system is put together by different teams of complete strangers who are giving up their time for free. So these things change on the underlying, and nobody can really direct them to do anything about it. That causes some problems. So now these games sometimes just don't boot up. Or the porting company may just not work with the publisher anymore, or they may not exist. That is a problem because now you have games that are officially sold on the store as being compatible with this, and now they're just not maintained. It's either broken, or they don't get updates anymore, or they don't get DLCs, and so they're just kind of in limbo. And engine developers are just mad because they're like, well, this was a waste of time, and now this is a lot of effort. And kind of a consequence of having such a technical user base is that a lot of Linux users are really used to submitting bug reports. Developers don't like that very much when you give them a lot of information, particularly when overwhelmingly, in a lot of cases, the most bug reports were coming from this Linux user base who are finding little intricacies that there's such a small percentage, but the volume's so loud. So it's a lot to take in all at the same time. And there's a future story with this. Rust, by Gary Newman at the team, the survival game, was ported for Linux, was a very enthusiastic component of this. And Gary just said on a blog post one day, guys, I don't think we've been doing this very well. We're just not going to do it anymore. But you guys get to be on your own island. That's cool. And they release a version of the game that you can still play, but you can pretty much only play with other Linux players. And it's never updated. And it's just this really old, bizarre, you're stuck there. Everybody else gets to move forward, new servers, everything. And you're just kind of with a couple other people who are tolerating this. So this lull stinks. What in the world are we supposed to do about that? If you were to have any major event occur that would change everything, that would really unlock this all, what would it be? Well, the correct answer is NieR Automata. So this game is really good. I highly recommend you play it. It's amazing. Platinum Games kicks it out of the park. Square Enix and the Platinum Games team don't do a very good job of releasing it on PC to begin with. The port's a bit strange. And it has a lot of weird crashes, but particularly they have not really great support on AMD drivers. Anybody who's had an AMD graphics card around this time definitely knows these were not fun to work on. But kind of a side consequence of how Valve has been paying for the development of this SteamOS system is that they've been working with AMD directly just to say, hey, your Linux drivers aren't that great either. Can we just work together on the open ones? And now a whole bunch of hobbyists, AMD employees, Valve employees are all working on the Linux side drivers. So one developer who is in Germany can't play NieR Automata at launch. What in the world are you to do? You create what's called DXVK. Philipp Ribel, also known as Deutschegene, also known on the forums as Yorha2b, which is awesome. That's like posting about this, creates a layer called DXVK, and that converts the now DirectX 11 calls, which are not super supported very well at this time from OpenGL. Again, DirectX 11 is quite advanced at this point, and converts it to Vulkan, that new other standard. And this is kind of the consequence, but Philip's kind of crazy, I suppose, and is very enthusiastic about this project because he couldn't run NieR Automata on his PC on Windows because the AMD drivers stunk. And his soonest answer is to spend 2 months disassembling undocumented Microsoft code and calls to make that work on the Linux system because it's preferable. 2 months for something completely undocumented is insane. And it works really well. It's super accurate. So I'll have a video here. It's got a little bit of audio. And I apologize, it's a bit crunchy. That's the nature of it. This was at launch, day one of NieR Automata, running on OpenGL and Wine. A little audio. So this game has a lot of particles in it. So now we've been hit, and now all the audio is just distorted forever. The shadows don't work as you expect. There's lots of hiccups. In a game that has bullet hell as a pretty major mechanic of how you do combat, having things freeze and distort is not very pleasant. It's also a very stylish game. You want it to look good. So now, after 2 months of just kind of grinding away and saying that we'll just tear apart Microsoft's code instead of buying a new graphics card, we have this, which is incredibly smooth in comparison. You have all the particles. The accuracy for things like shadows and how everything looks is just nice. It is very stable. A lot of the consequences of having kind of a having like a high level emulation like we had before with OpenGL was that you couldn't perfect some of the minute details. And in a game where you're spamming particles and sword slashes everywhere, you want to get the details right. And so this was kind of a great entry game for this. So this makes a very big splash. As you can imagine, just kind of this guy has come out of relatively obscure sources in this case. He's still actively posting on like Linux news site comment threads on forums. And now he's just done this all with a small team of other contributors. It's pretty snazzy, and it's pretty invigorating at the time. So at this point, Valve now just directly gives him a call and has a chat and just says, do you want to work with us? And he says yes. So very cool. Now you have the financial might of the biggest gaming store to help you maintain and pay contributors for this application that now makes these games easy to run elsewhere. Now we've kind of we have the weight of Valve also to harass graphics card manufacturers to please fix their Vulkan support. DXVK kind of uncovers, because it's trying to be by the book to the standards, a lot of kind of bugs with how some of these were implemented, and so Valve gets to work with AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, etc., and get them to fix these things. And so drivers get a whole lot better pretty quickly. That's pretty cool. And now, kind of a consequence of this, you now have the ability to translate how these games look, and we have Wine already, which lets us run the applications. What if we get in the business of packaging them together and making that a product? So Valve creates Proton. There's no official logo for this, but I needed a graphic, so it's not official. Don't try to associate that. So by summer of 2018, so this is only a short couple months away from that initial demonstration of NieR Automata working, Valve announces it's called SteamPlay, which was this whole Proton project. And so this now is a project in specific. Valve is paying employees to just fix weird stuff that's happening in games. And the best way to figure that out is, what if we just make a GitHub issue for like every game people are playing with it, and everybody can just dump information. Remember what I said earlier about the kind of person who uses Linux is really into bug reports? These are big threads, and they find a lot of interesting fixes quickly. Something that you kind of learn when you're in the business of trying to make standards work other places is that people don't adhere to standards at all. And a lot of these games are kind of duct taped together and do a lot of kind of hacky things. And also a lot of them just aren't maintained. We can't get updates to make it better. But now this has kind of created a situation where instead of Valve asking developers to make the ports, they say, we'll do it for you. Don't worry about it. It'll just work. That's quite the endeavor for the world's biggest software store. They went for it. The community loves this. You get a lot of reports very fast. So in just a span of about a year or so, 2019 into 2020, over 11,000 games are tested, reported, and uploaded to a database where everybody can track, hey, how'd you get that to work? What bugs was that? And the amount of these that are getting like primary support, platinum, as the community was referring to them, keeps going up, because now we keep finding all these weird oddities. So, Wine's been around since like early 2090s. Like, it's a very old project. And suddenly, just an influx of people trying to play video games has now just kind of disassembled a whole lot more of Windows than anybody ever thought to see. That's pretty cool. It's kind of a strange way to do it, but we'll take it. So an example of a success story. This is the Final Fantasy XIV launcher for the game. The trial is free, by the way. You can play it. Square put together this launcher a pretty long time ago. It uses a bunch of kind of arcane old Internet Explorer calls for some reason, And a lot of these were things that nobody in like the corporate world, when Crossover was doing this business for companies, ever really encountered. And this game is pretty important. There's a like incredibly large percentage of the Steam user base at any time is just playing this one game. And you want to get it right. So this is just a great experience of, hey, we can now disassemble all these weird Internet Explorer calls. And now, 1, 2, 3, you wanted to get Final Fantasy XIV working, and now a whole suite of completely unrelated games and applications now all work way better. It's a pretty cool outcome. But Square is a bit strange, and so they announced a new launcher. But they didn't make sure that the launcher actually worked on the other ports. Square sells a Mac license for Final Fantasy XIV. You can still buy this, and you have to have separate licenses and separate DLCs for everything you play on it. That's to justify they pay Crossover, the wine support company, to help them make this port. The problem is that they released this with even more arcane, weird Internet Explorer calls. And so the buttons and the fields just don't load, and you just can't log in. So Square knows this, and instead of like using like Chromium base like everybody else does, or just maybe like a regular login window, they say, oh, if you're paying for the Mac version, you get to keep the old one. Nobody else gets to have it though. Guys, what are we doing? But again, this is kind of a good example. In part, Gabe Newell has said in interviews that like he plays 14 a lot, and so there's a lot of high priority bugs that come into just making this game work. And so again, you get more and more fixes completely accidentally for completely inadvertent things. Somebody's corporate software that didn't work yesterday might work now because this launcher was not good. And the sad part about this all was that the game at all points worked fine. There was no problem with the game. It was always just the launcher. So you now have a healthy base of a lot of people who are now doing these bug reports. Games are working a lot better. And if you're using Steam on your PC on Linux, you can just hit play and Proton will probably run your game. Valve is now in the business of reviewing to make sure that these games work. And now it's working so well that some of these old games, like your Civilizations and such, that had official ports, work better with Proton and work better on with this wine layer. So it's better than the company that was paid to maintain it before. And now we know it will keep working because it's not changing, right? Wine's just one thing. Valve announces now the SteamDeck. Ooh, they've kind of realized that they, in the hardware business, have really had a good time with, hey, I think we did pretty good on controllers. And we put a screen in that controller that one time. You remember that one? And internally, people are just walking down the hallways and looking at each other and just saying, why aren't we doing this? So they do. They put in a lot of man hours and they come up with what we now know as the SteamDeck. So all of these previous iterations that have all just kind of been for a kind of guiding idea have now merged up and just kind of created a killer product. So things like the hardware designs for the Steam machines is like useful for being in the system design business. DXVK, of course, now we can run Proton, and all the controller support from years ago. That was just to make big picture work pretty well and to make games a little more controller friendly, has now added up into a system where you don't have to worry about having the controller support. Valve solved that already. So they can just say, hey, this is a new controller, and it'll just kind of work. It's pretty cool. And it's intentionally designed to be open. In interviews, Valve basically just said, yeah, I mean, it's a computer. You can do what you want with it. That's the purpose. We're not going to lock it down. And I think that was a pretty good move. Because, it's created so many incredible things. Just based on the fact that you can install whatever you want on it. But they had to insist. Because now we're getting into territory where a lot of people who are coming in for this game console that runs, it's like, oh, I can run my games on the go. It's got a good battery life compared to Windows. A lot of these people don't know how Linux works, and they're going to have technical problems for what they're trying to do. So how do you solve for that? They called Flatpaks. So Valve introduces kind of an app store on the Steam Deck you can use in the desktop mode that you can just download these applications, but they are completely sandboxed. It's kind of like a iPhone app, right? It doesn't leave its square unless you've told it that it's allowed to. So if you want to run a application here, it has everything it needs inside of itself, and it doesn't need to talk to the exterior system. So you just install, and it works because it had to. It came with everything pre-installed. This avoids the problem from before where you build for like Ubuntu or something, and then suddenly that loses support. Well, now everything's in here, so it can't break. Like, nobody can change the underlying pieces. It'll just keep going. Of course, you can bypass this if you like. Again, that's user choice. I think that's awesome, and I think that's, again, created an incredible community. There's also just many indie games that are now getting published. Thematically for this year's Sonic theme of MAGFest, I highly recommend Dr. Robotnik's Ring Racers. It's pretty cool. It's just a Sonic-themed kart game based on the Doom engine from a Sonic fan game that I played when I was 10 years old, and people are still developing for this now. That's incredible. As well, Valve, again, because they're not in the business of locking it down. Obviously, they want it to be easy to play your Steam games because they don't want users to really fret about what the interface looks like, right? So, like, this just works, right? You look at it, you pick a game, you hit play. And there's no part of this that's not a console. But that's not to say you can't use other stores. So they let you just download other stores completely. Like, this is Heroic Launcher. If you buy or get your infinite free games seemingly from the Epic Games Store, or if you buy from Good Old Games, GOG, you can just hit this launcher and it installs the game for you, and it puts it in your Steam menu, just like all your Steam games. It just keeps working, and that's open, and I think that's awesome. So now you have a really big user base of people who are now installing all kinds of fun, weird software, and now they're excited about this hardware. It sells incredibly well. So now the community is just like, okay, what if we just keep building on the idea? So there's a team that goes back to reverse engineer like DirectX 8 and, okay, shove it into DXVK. DirectX 9, shove it in. You now have all this accumulating support from just further and further back in the catalog. And so all these old games, again, that in the future may not have great support. We don't know if like we're gonna maintain support for something DirectX 8, right? Like, it's like Lego Island level back. It's been a long time. Now people are doing the work now while things are still supported and they can still test. And now we've solved it forever, which is pretty cool. And so you get a lot of that community in. Games and emulators also pick up support and directly target making this work, because that's exciting. So things like Xenia, it's an Xbox emulator, which they were like, okay, well, the Xbox uses DirectX, let's just use DirectX, keeps it easy. Now it's a first-class citizen to run Vulkan on this, so you can run it on your Steam Deck. Awesome. More portability. It's going to keep adding on itself. And people are now directly also targeting the Steam Deck as like their base development environment, right? So on PC, it was kind of the thing that everybody complained about, is everyone's computers are way too different. We don't know what's like supported here. The hardware in this is okay, let's be honest. It's not a super stellar thing. It runs games at 720p. That's all it needs to do. But that's a pretty good target for like a kind of mid-low end PC. And now a lot of game developers are actively just making sure, how well does it work on that? Because then it'll probably work on everything else. Pretty sweet. And this last bullet in here is a pretty interesting one. So this is kind of an ongoing problem with the community right now. Anti-cheat. It's kind of a controversial subject matter. There's a lot of anti-cheat out there that if it found out it was running in Wine, nope, I won't touch it. It'll just break the game. Not that the game's actually broken, it's just the anti-cheat is scared of being in Wine, right? And now you have some games that are running at like kernel level for anti-cheat, your Valorants of the world, etc. And so like that's kind of complicated. You can't really do that in Wine super well. But now these vendors who are working on it are actively working with Valve to just make this work in Proton, which is pretty cool. Like they have all these little cutouts to just make sure, yeah, if you're playing this competitive shooter or whatever on the go, you can do that. It's not going to break, and you're still having decent anti-cheat ability here, right? You're not letting people run free reign. That's pretty nice. And then Apple gets in on it, which is a bit strange. As you may recall kind of earlier in the talk we're talking about, Apple intentionally didn't support Vulkan because they really want you to use Metal. Well, unless you're directly working with Apple, like Metal supports, you're not probably having first of mind. And so recently, with the new kind of M1 style MacBooks, they're not using Intel anymore, they said, okay, we're going to release, it's called the Game Porting Toolkit. And the Game Porting Toolkit is DXVK. But instead of the Vulkan part, the VK, they put Metal in there. But it's DXMT. It's the same code. It's the whole same project. Apple just kind of took DXVK, packaged it up with their own fancy wrapper for Metal, and now they're publishing this as a product. So this means now, even on the Apple side, a completely inadvertent event here is that now we're getting even better support on these devices, even if they were never the target market. Example, Final Fantasy XIV again. I play this game a lot. It's a pretty good example for this. The aforementioned Mac license for Final Fantasy XIV, right? They charge for it. It doesn't work very great. Again, it still runs OpenGL. Crossover still maintains it, but it's a bit risky to do anything else. The community just said, okay, but it could run better. And so they made this. It's called 14 on Mac. And it's their own launcher that doesn't use Internet Explorer arcane calls. Would you believe it? It looks good. Oh, huh? And this now uses the Game Porting Toolkit in it. So now you get all of the functionality and the improved graphics performance of your DXVK, and it just works on the Mac. And you don't have to change anything. It works better, it's faster, and you don't have to rebuy the licenses. That's a pretty cool community project that wouldn't have been possible if somebody couldn't run NieR Automata a couple years ago. And another part of this is it doesn't just affect running it on other systems. This has had knock-on effects that have kind of changed a lot of individual hobbies. So for one, Intel recently started releasing graphics cards. They're pretty interesting. I won't comment beyond. So the previous, there's a lot of older games that have bug fixes. Something that's interesting in Windows game drivers is a lot of them have like hacks for these games to make them work standard. Intel doesn't have the knowledge to do that for that many decades back of games, right? There's a lot of things that are broken. So how do you solve for it? You can just use DXVK on Windows now. So Intel is now going on, instead of using the Windows native feature, you're going to convert the Windows native code to Vulkan on Windows because they do that better than Microsoft supports it with the Intel driver now. So again, now we have extended support where we're seeing we just have this extra functionality even in Windows where older games just run better now. Pretty sweet. And if you're ever familiar in a lot of MMOs especially, 14, but other individual games, there's projects like Reshade, right? So you can do custom graphics setups with your lighting, your particles, and you can really snazz it up. You can make it look fancy. That's based on DXVK. And that's because now we have just full access to read what these graphics APIs are doing because we have DXVK in place, and that's all open source code. So you can finagle with it all you want, and you can apply all kinds of cool effects. Flatpaks from the whole App Store component of the SteamDeck are now massively more popular. You have so much cool support for all these cool indie games, all these individual softwares that all run, and it's portable, and you just don't have to worry about it working. So it does. So you can just boot up now any Linux, you don't worry about it, and the applications will just work if you download them from the store. It's as easy as if you were using an iPhone or something to that effect, or an Android device. That's pretty sweet. And to the port earlier, we won't have to reinvent the wheel in the future about this, about how to port a lot of the software. We're now going through such an incredibly large backlog of weird game glitches that have had knock-on effects that now this is all quite open, documented, and because we're using things like Vulkan or DXVK, this now goes everywhere else. Like we don't have to worry about porting it. For example, on these Macs, there's a team, one of the team members is a VTuber. It's an interesting project. It's called Asahi Linux. and they just are like, hey, we're going to run Linux on the MacBook. So they have this entire project, they're reverse engineering it, and these don't even use Intel processors, but we have DXVK, and that's where the heavy lifting is for a lot of the graphics. So now you can run a program that you can run your entire Windows game library with DXVK on a MacBook that has a processor that's nothing like anything that was supported before. But because this is also genericized now, it just works out of the box. So in the future, you're going to have all kinds of cool new devices, new processors, setups, etc. It's already solved. We don't have to go back for this. That's pretty cool. Any questions at all?
Do you think the next logical step for Valve might be to take their OS and Proton and perhaps try and make it an actual operating system for a PC build?
So they seem to be indicating now that they're actually working with manufacturers to get this on new devices. So your kind of your Asus devices of the future are all going to have the potential to run SteamOS. I think for Valve, it's probably for the best if they don't make it a consumer OS. I only just say that because if you're using your full desktop, you kind of want a more flexibility in your system. You're going to want to install whatever you want. The SteamDeck is set up so you don't break it, right? It's got a little bit of a layer of training wheels on it so that people aren't blowing stuff up and then complaining to Valve why their games don't work, right? So it makes it very obvious you're changing things. A personal PC, I don't think ideally would be the case, but they seem like they are spreading it out. It's not impossible. With the beard, yep. Yes.
So I'm a sound designer that mainly works with the Windows OS, and I've been trying to get off of that because of Microsoft's bullshit and all that.
Mm-hmm. They have a lot of that lately.
In their TOS, basically, it says that they're allowed to spy on your files no matter what you do.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there are any steps making other Windows apps work on a Linux environment like Reaper and such. Reaper is already open source, but
yeah. So there's
I'm talking about other plugins and such. Would they? Or any other Windows apps, would they be ported to Linux in the future?
It's kind of a situation where this might be a consequence of, again, how weird games are, where we're seeing improved performance for these other kind of more niche use cases, like audio development, things like that. So I don't know that there's anybody who's actively like paying Crossover, for example, to do the dev work for a lot of these specific things. But I think just coincidentally by accident, a lot of this will fall into place, especially now more and more. The percentage of people who are actually using these Linux systems, to your point, a lot of people are not really very happy with Windows 11. Some people, you actually just can't upgrade to it because you don't have the right TPM on your hardware. So you're just stuck. And a lot of people are now giving this a try. And so I think with a little bit more time and use cases like yours, right, where we have these user bases, it's just going to kind of progressively occur. But I don't know that right now there's anybody who's actively targeting that, you know?
Thank you.
In the front?
What do you think the viability is in the future of getting DXVK working on Linux on like reduced instruction set processors like ARM, RISC-V, stuff like that?
I mean, it appears now. Disclaimer. I am not a compiler of this software, right? I'm just a really big fan. I think it's quite possible because in DXVK now you have ARM64 support, which is kind of like supported with layers, right? So you can do Box64 will convert ARM to run your x86 programs. But once you have DXVK, that's just a layer for Vulkan. It works. Once you have the layer where you're just talking to Vulkan calls directly, it's very quick. Reduced instruction sets, like your RISC-Vs of the world, I think are probably quite attainable in the future with it. I don't know that we have a Box64 equivalent of that on RISC yet, though.
No, I think Box64 might work for that too, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, that's because we're getting rid of the overhead of having to deal with like the DirectX part. It's so much faster as soon as we're just talking Vulkan. In the back in the yellow? Sure. I was a big Kubuntu user, and that's because it came in a CD I get in a magazine for free. So So I was really checking it out. I was really giving it the merits by the one that I had the CD for. So I started on that so many years ago, and I've kind of stuck with it. I really like KDE. And yes, up front.
Hi. So in this last generation of consoles, you sort of saw like consoles and portables kind of squishing together to become one. One of the things that's been really cool throughout, like this generation, is watching those, like, especially with the SteamDeck, right? Like the technology being used with like cloud and being able to like sync your data like that. Your PC is now essentially becoming like your portable console, right? Like,
It's consoleized.
yeah, exactly. Like, how much longer do you think until like there's just like, I guess, PC and console kind of collapsing on itself?
I think they're kind of doing that now, huh?
Yeah, I guess my thing is, when do you think like the majority of the market is going to go towards that? Or,
I think it's kind of the situation where we have to kind of wait for the PC market to expand like it is. It's anecdotal. I don't have data on this, so I'm going to speak a little generally and maybe a little broad. I might be wrong. It seems like a lot of people recently have been giving PC gaming more of a try over time. I don't like people I know who have PS5s and things just don't use them just because they're on their PC so much. You have all the games, why wouldn't you? And I think it's just going to keep approaching that critical mass, especially with current gen game consoles are basically PCs in fancy cases. The hardware is all the same. And so the lines that previously were so stark are blurring a lot now. I think probably even next two console generations, other than, of course, Nintendo, who gets, they're doing their Nintendo thing. But
they didn't even like, I feel like they haven't even tried making their console
it's
work.
like the Switch is such an interesting setup, and now the Switch 2 is the same thing. They're in their own island. Sony and Microsoft are both like, all right, we'll start putting the games on PC. Fine. The machines are basically PCs anyway. Whatever. It's just a cheap PC. But now, like, it's incredible how many people just don't even buy console exclusives. So we'll be like, oh, I'll wait like a year or something. I'll get it on PC. I'm sorry.
So one thing that's been very striking to me with this generation for consoles is Microsoft doing a lot of hard pivoting for cloud gaming, I think is what they call it internally, but like things like Game Pass or having the same software run on the Xbox as they run on Windows. And we've had a lot of issues with not being able to run those things through Wine so far with the new way that they're handling executables. Do you know of what kind of progress is being made right now for breaking into supporting that in the future?
I haven't had a lot of experience with having to work with that quite yet myself. As far as kind of those portable binaries, it's kind of a weird problem with Microsoft, right? Because their studios are also disaligned. Your Microsoft flight simulators of the world are a completely bog standard, like regular engine game, and then on the other side they'll have this entire layer, like you're saying, of these unified apps, and it's just, why aren't we like? There's no congruence here.
Yeah,
So
I've been trying and failing for a couple of years on getting like one of their exclusives that's on that. And it's been.
I'm interested in what game you're talking about. We'll think about through. We'll do a talk with it because I'm interested to kind of dig into that myself. Up front.
So with the new or with the ongoing Mac support, again that being kind of a almost like a side off from what the original point, right? How long do you think it'll take until the support's good enough where whenever your brother plays Roblox, it doesn't look like a Microsoft slideshow?
I think we're more or less there now, right? We have native, but it's just before Mac gaming. Just again, another side tangent. It's a Linux panel, but I keep talking about this. It was really just so weird for so long.
It was.
Apple just did not care. You're not using metal. Your fault. I think in the back in the orange. I think it's the last one. Yep.
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion now about, abstraction layers, and there was a bit of a segue into like what Apple was doing with M1 chips. So there's a lot of hardware development in mobile right now. What do you see replacing mobile here in preservation of, applications that only run on mobile and
Mhm.
Can I run a DirectX 8 game on my mobile device?
So, in kind of the other direction, there's a lot of developers now who are making games that are like targeting Vulkan, and then they're releasing games on like the iPhone store or the Mac App Store, and they're using Molten VK. Get it, Molten, because it's melting the metal, and that's Valve's layer where they're being like, okay, you can keep developing for that, and you can work it here. In the Android game space, I know there's a lot of improvements lately, also especially for emulators to use Vulkan, so it's very performant. In iOS, it's kind of hard because Apple doesn't really like anybody touching that with a 10-foot pole. Hopefully, now that we have kind of like on these M1 Macs, like you can run like iPad apps, things like that, somebody's going to kind of get the idea where you can be like, why can't I run everything else and get those layers in place? But to your point, I think, again, in a situation where you're running a game, there's not really a situation where you're on mobile and you would run DirectX, right? But a lot of these abstraction layers have made portability super easy. So I think it's probably, again, sooner than we think that people will just target this and be like, yeah, but I can just target it, boot for Vulkan. It's going to keep being more portable in the future. I was kind of rambling. I hope that helped. I think we're over time, unfortunately. This has been a lot of fun, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.